Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Amanda Dumas. I'm going to be your presenter this afternoon for 10th grade geometry. Before we get started, I do have a bachelor's and a master's in mathematics education, and I also have a master's in instructional design and development. Put up here, this is going to be my 22nd year teaching mathematics and my 16th year teaching Algebra 1. I taught geometry 1 year when they switched that to 9th grade. So for most of you, when you were in high school, up until about 3 years ago, Algebra 1 was in 9th grade, but now we switched it to 10th grade. It does make it a little easier for the students from a teacher standpoint, because what we finish Algebra 1 with is where they start Algebra 2. So they'll start Algebra 2 with a little review of Algebra 1 when they go to Algebra 2. So one of the things we want to discuss, instead of doing the whole first semester like English did, we're going to go over just the first quarter for math. So in the first quarter, if your student is taking the regular Algebra 1 with probability, they're going to go at a slower pace. They're only going to cover 2.5 units. So we do skip some material within those units that the honors would be covering, and there are no suggested performance tasks for them to complete. And they are, and this is the very important part for regular diploma, they are allowed to retake 1 test per quarter. The honors class, however, if they are signed up for honors, is a faster pace. We will completely cover 3 units, and during those 3 units, they will have extra lessons that the other students did not have, and they have 3 performance tasks that they are suggested to complete, and they are not allowed to retest any test. Yes, sir?
The honor scores for the no retest, they take into account children that have 504s.
Typically, if they're in honors, the 504 just gives them extended time and calculator usage, and so that's not really a retest. But that would be at the school's discretion. It's according to what that 504 says, but typically, most 504s are extended time and calculator usage.
I know when I was in school, I had the honors diploma at regular. I know they have changed it, but it was a time where you can do Algebra 1A and 1B, everything was just one.
We no longer have AB, yes ma'am. The resources are going to be the same. Someone asked earlier, we do use the same textbook. The textbook is available online, and we do have printed copies that are available to the students. I, myself as a teacher, prefer for them to use the online one if they have internet access, and the reason is that textbook is better not only for the regular but for the honors. They can go in and access videos that are extra to what the teacher had taught. They can access homework. For me, that's the benefit for the teacher. If I assign them 10 homework problems in there, if they do it, they can't share it with their buddy. Because when their buddy opens up those 10 problems, they get 10 similar but not the same problems. So if the answer to yours was 5, your buddy's answer is not going to be 5. His answer is going to be something else. And so that way it eliminates children getting credit for things that they don't really know. And it also immediately tells them if they've got it correct or incorrect. And if they got it incorrect, it gives them suggestions of how to fix it. And so that is one reason the online textbooks, in my opinion, is a good resource to have. So the other thing at the bottom is this year we were asked during the first 2 weeks of school to do diagnostic and relationship building activities. So the reason I've also mentioned that is if you have a student that's in regulars and they're like, this is so easy, and maybe I should switch to honors. The first 2 weeks for everybody is supposed to be that diagnostic and getting to know school rules and that sort of thing. So it may seem super easy, but it will eventually take off and go much faster for the honors class. And so the regular things, well, this is so slow. It's slow for a purpose. It's so that we can get the school year started. In the first quarter, we're going to cover solving equations and inequalities. Then we will look at linear equations and then linear functions. So the regular class will complete 1 and 2 and only do half of that third unit. The honors class will do all 3 of those units completely within the first quarter. So that first unit, the solving equations and inequalities, notice for regular classes, there are 17 days allotted for that on the pacing guide, and for the honors, only 16 days. So they will learn operations on real numbers, such as the difference between rational and irrational, integers, whole numbers. They will learn how to deal with fractions and decimals, placing them from least to greatest, converting forms, and that's the very first lesson of the first unit. Then we will look at how to solve multiple step equations with one variable with each problem, so there will only be one variable x or one variable y. Then they will look at multiple steps equations with one variable that appears more than once, so they'll have to group like terms. Multiple step inequalities with one variable, compound inequalities, that's and ors, absolute value equations and inequalities, and then the honors also have to solve literal equations. Literal equations are where, if you remember from science class, converting from Celsius to Fahrenheit, or taking an equation that was written to find slope, but you turn it around to find y-intercept. So it's to take a variable and change it to find a different variable. So it's got multiple variables. You're not really solving for a number. You're just, as I tell my students, we're rearranging the letters to find a different emphasis. This, like I said, for honors is 16 days, even though they have one extra unit or one extra lesson, and regular has 17 days. If you had Algebra 1 in high school, this is probably the same thing that you had in that regular Algebra 1 class years ago. The literal equations are a little more difficult, and that's probably the hardest thing. Compound inequalities, that's less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and they do graph those as well. Then Unit 2, you'll notice that honors speeds up. They're going to do all 4 of these lessons, and they're going to do them in 10 days. And that includes the test and the performance task. And regular gets 14 days. So I put up there and I tried to put the formula, because sometimes, even as a teacher, I know that when I was in school, sometimes my teachers didn't really call it what it was. So slope intercept form, that was that y equals mx plus b. M represents your slope, b represents your y-intercept. We will not only manipulate that formula to find the slope-intercept and the slope, but we will also graph it on a coordinate plane, Cartesian plane. Then the point slope form, y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. They will graph that, they will find their slope, and they will also, when given 2 points or when given 1 point and a slope. Then standard form, ax plus by equals c. They'll use that graphing as well, which is when you find your x and y intercepts. And they will algebraically put it into that form, because when they get to Unit 4, we have to do systems of equations, and they have to know how to use standard equations for that, standard form. And then they do parallel and perpendicular lines, which should, for most students, be kind of nice, because they just came from geometry, and for geometry they had to explore parallel and perpendicular lines. So for some students, they're like, ooh, yay, back to shapes. And so and notice that all 4 of those objectives are for both honors and regular. It's just regular gets a little more time to cover it. Any questions about that unit? I forgot to ask that on the first one. Okay, so this is where linear functions would be the 3rd unit that we cover in first quarter. So I'm actually going to start with the honors, because honors, they will do relations and functions, they will do linear functions, they will do transforming linear functions with vertical and horizontal shifts, they will do arithmetic sequences, they will also do scatter plots and linear lines of fit, and analyzing lines of fit. Notice that the last 2 says honors only. Whenever you look over at the regular, notice it only says relations and functions and linear functions, and it's 8 days. They only cover half of this unit, and it's not even, technically it's not even half, because they don't cover the whole unit, because they have 2 extra objectives, 2 extra sets. So relations and functions, that's domain, range, sets, relations, and one-to-one functions. They should have most likely seen that in middle school. Domain is your x values, your range is your y values. Your relations, they learn about the relations and the sets and how if something is one-to-one. Then when we get to the linear functions, we learn about function notation, different representations of linear data using graphs and charts. And so that goes back to the first chapter where we talked about slope and slope intercept. And regular will be finished, and that should be the end of first quarter for them. However, honors would continue on with the transformations of if I shift or move the graph up, or if I move, which would be vertical, or if I shift or move it left to right, which is horizontal. Arithmetic sequences, the regular class will see that second quarter. Arithmetic sequences are usually pretty simple for students. It's got a fancy name. It just means that we made a series of numbers using addition or subtraction. So 2, 4, 6, 8, or 5, 10, 15, 20. That's the arithmetic. We just kept adding 2 or kept adding 5. And students catch on to that usually pretty quick. It's that common difference. Honors, however, scatter plots and lines of fit. We do in Mobile County have graphing calculators that help with this. And this goes a little bit with the statistics of what we're doing. A scatter plot, you have a lot of points and you try to find the line that best manipulates through those and best fits that data. And we analyze the data to figure out if it's a positive or a negative or no fit. And so that's what those last 2 sections are. That may have been something that if you did take Algebra 1 years ago that you did not see because it's kind of needs that graphing calculator. The students typically at most schools, I know at my school, they cannot take that graphing calculator home, but there is a graphing calculator free called Desmos that I always let all my students know about, DESMOS. And so when they're doing their homework, if they're in honors, they might want to use that. I see somebody picking up the pencils. DESMOS, Desmos. It is an absolutely free online graphing calculator that they can use. And they can set up their own account. And when they do that, they can even save, like if they graph something and they want to save it and look at it again later, they can do that. They can save their graphs, especially if they have problems and they think, well, I know I've done this wrong, it doesn't look right. They can save it and take it and show it to the teacher the next day and go, okay, this is what I tried. Why is it not right? I know it's not right. That sort of thing. Okay? Okay, so the major emphasis of that first quarter is once we get started, notice that we did 2 whole units on linear equations. And part of the Alabama course of study is that we have real-world applications. And one of the things I tell someone is I try to do an extra activity with my students, and I included it for today, is to try to get that real-world application. And so this one I use for both of my classes, whether it's regulars or an honors, or even last year when I had an essentials, which is a special education version of this Algebra 1, I still include this because when you don't have context to what you're doing, you don't necessarily understand why you're doing it. And so this activity, we started in this section, but in quarter 2, they will wind up doing something called systems of equations, where you deal with 2 equations at one time, and we use these again there. So I put up there, it's about a business. So I tell my students about, there's a TV show on, or used to be on TV, called Restaurants Impossible, where a chef by the name of Robert Irvine goes out and he finds restaurants that are failing. And he usually has a couple of reasons why they fail. Cleanliness, bad food, and then a lot of times though, it's that they don't understand how to manage their money. And I told him about this one particular episode where he shows up and the restaurant is full of customers and it's a beautiful restaurant, but they're going bankrupt and they can't figure out why. And so he goes in and he says, well, what's everybody ordering? And they said, a steak and potatoes with bread and a salad and a dessert. And he said, how much is that? And they said, $12. Well, your face, some of your faces is the same as my students. They went, $12? How they get all that for $12? I said, well, why do you think they're going bankrupt? And so, and that was his immediate reaction. You can't give everybody that for $12. I said, well, so what is the problem with that? You have to understand how much something costs before you can sell it. So that's where we come up with this next little activity. If we're going to sell something, we need to know how much it costs to sell it. And so we talk about the rate of change. So the slope is the rate that you need to produce it. So how much did all that food cost? But is that the only thing they were having to pay for? Because is that the only thing you need in a kitchen? So the other items, the things that you need to be able to produce the item, the things that you can reuse, that is your beginning price. That's where you went and bought all of your supplies before you got started. So I gave you a worksheet. Hopefully everybody got one. Tried to hand them out while people were not in the room. If you don't have one, you'll let me know. I'll bring you one. At the top of it, it should say old-fashioned banana pudding. So in my classroom, we go over this one, and this is a legitimate recipe. It really works. I make this particular item all the time, and I actually have my students then go out and find their own item. And it doesn't have to be food, but it typically is, because if you make it and bring it on presentation day, you get bonus points. But they can do anything. I've had students make blankets. I've had the students that were at the Bryant Center go and weld items together and bring them to school. I've had people make candles. And I've even had students that have gone as far as enjoying what they've done so much and having such a positive reaction from their classmates that they've actually started their own little businesses, selling monogrammed cups, or selling the candles, or selling the stuff, the crocheted animals they've made, because they figured out that it wasn't that bad and they enjoyed doing it. They really had a business. So I have the students, we go through this in class. So this is the very top. It says banana. If you look at the bottom of your paper, it has two lists. One says the items that are your M, which items are reusable. So before I went to this slide, I had the same thing written, so I'm going to go back. So it says slope is your rate of change. In this situation, slope is the constant to produce each item. The y-intercept is the cost to begin producing the items, non-consumable, reusable items. So then on your worksheet that I gave you, there are two columns. Column 1 is where you're going to put the things that you think are non-consumable, non-reusable. And in column 2, you put the non-consumable, the reusable items. So we go through, and this is the trick that I tell my students. Sometimes you have hidden items when you're looking at a particular list. So we go through these, and I go, okay, it says 1 cup of granulated sugar divided. Well, the first thing that students usually get is what about that is consumable? The sugar. But what did it imply that I needed that is not consumable, but I need to go buy if I'm going to have this business? A measuring cup. Okay? So that's where we go through. The students, I give them time, and we go through, and they try to fill out these 2 columns. And then we go through and see what we missed. Because that's usually where we mess up on this, is not understanding exactly what all we need to count. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few minutes for you to go ahead and look through and see. And there are, depending on what you do, more than I have of the list. So go through and see if you can pick out the things that would be your slope, your rate that you need more of, and the things that would be your beginning cost, your y-intercept. because you get to buy it and reuse it. So you may wonder, this might not seem very math, but it really does come out to a big thing. Because when we do graphing, they have to figure out their y-intercept, which is where they begin. And so this makes it a little easier. Because what do you realize? Before I can begin doing any of this, I've got to have a stove. I have to have a refrigerator. I have to have measuring cups. And I can reuse those things. That was my beginning debt. And so we start with that. So went through. So I'm going to back up just a little bit. So we talked about the needed, and this is kind of where I feel like this is a real world application. They had to read, so it is a little bit of cross curriculum there. But when we go through, we had to have the cup, we have to have the 4 tablespoons, we have to have eggs, we have to have, and you have to have the refrigerator, you have to have a cup of milk. Well, this is where students, we get that real world application. Can I use the same measuring cups I use for flour or for the milk? That's a new set of measuring cups. That's a different kind. And so for students that haven't had home economics, they learn something new in class. Oh, there's different types of measuring cups. Not necessarily math, but it is important because that is something we're going to need for science class. Then we get down to the next set. And it does tell them they need the saucepan. It tells them, and so at that point, hopefully, it tells them to combine. They realize they need something to combine that with. It tells them that they need to turn the heat on. So hopefully, they realize they need some sort of stove. And so there's some reading in between the lines and some deductive logic that they need to know. And we get all the way to the end. Here are some of the things that I put on there. The consumable M's are your sugar, your flour, your salt, your eggs, your milk, your vanilla extract, your vanilla wafers, your bananas. A disposable pan, because if it's a business, you're going to want to use a disposable pan. Tin foil, because it said to cover at the end. It didn't have to be tin foil. You could set saran wrap if you wanted to. Under the non-consumables, that's the one I came up with more. You got to have the measuring cups, both for solids and liquids, measuring spoons. Egg separator. Well, if it's a business, you might separate eggs with your hands at home, but if it's a business, you might want to use an egg separator. That would be a preference. You need the refrigerator, the saucepan, the whisk, the stove with oven, because it tells you to bake your meringue. A timer, because it tells you to time it if your oven didn't have a timer. You need a knife to cut the bananas. Never told you that you needed a knife, but it did tell you to cut them. You need a stand mixer or a hand mixer, and it did tell you to spread out stuff. So once they figure that out, we go back and we do some more basic math from that first unit that they did, which was understanding numbers. You can't, so where would I take this with my students? This is not a one-day thing, it takes them a couple days. Told you to use 4 eggs. Can you go to the store and just buy 4 eggs? So they have to figure out how much does just 4 eggs cost. The flour, it said to use 4 tablespoons. I can't buy 4 tablespoons of flour. So I have to figure out how much just 4 tablespoons of flour cost. I can't just buy 8 bananas. So how much did 8 bananas cost? The second list is usually a little easier because you buy a whole set of measuring cups, you buy a whole set of measuring spoons, you buy a whole stove. But when you get the consumables, they start realizing that's why it's your rate, because you got to have a little bit for every recipe. And every time you make a recipe, you got to have a little bit more. And so we use that, and so that's how we come up with that. They should have did this to figure out that $12 for that steak meal was not realistic. And they start thinking, and as a teacher, this is a real big eye-opener for them, and it always is really satisfying for me because students and some parents give me some feedback usually if they're like, my child never realized that when they asked me to make their favorite dessert that it costs so much. And they'll come to me and they're like, do you know butter is $6 a pound? Why is butter $6 a pound? I'm like, that's how much it costs. And I was like, well, we're just not going to put butter in my recipe. I'm going to use something else. So that's always interesting to figure out when they start realizing real cost. And so this does relate back to the real world. And then for that last segment for when we do ours. Also, they have to come out with a comparison price. So that's the second equation. So how much did it cost? So how much can you sell it for? And so this would be kind of sums up that entire first semester, that first quarter for my students when we do this, because they have to figure out the units, they have to figure out their slope, they have to find out their y-intercept. Now, I did mention that the textbook is online, and it does have the questions and things on there as well. They have the videos if you need those videos. And it does have a little tutoring because you can go in and it has a feature where you can say, help me do this, and it will help them do those. It won't help them with the task, but it will help as they need homework, help with that sort of thing.